Poor Waitress asks Billionaire for help in the cold to raise her daughter. His reaction is heartwarming. The knock on the door echoed 3 times. Grace knew what it meant. "Just 5 more minutes, please," she whispered to herself, looking at Chloe sleeping, clutching a faded teddy bear. The girl's blonde hair spread across the thin pillow like sunbeams on a cloudy day. The 4th knock came louder. "Miss Coleman, open the door." Grace took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. The landlord was there, accompanied by 2 large men. She didn't need to ask who they were. 48 hours, as we agreed, the man said, adjusting his glasses on his nose. "The rent went up to $800. You haven't paid." "I know, Mr. Peterson, but I have 300. It's all I have right now. Next week, there is no next week." He nodded to the men. "Pack up her things." Chloe woke up with the noise. Her blue eyes opened slowly, confused. "Mommy!" Grace ran to her, trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going on an adventure." The men entered the tiny room. In 10 minutes, everything Grace and Chloe owned was in 2 old suitcases and 3 plastic bags, a whole life fitting into so little. "Mommy, where are we going?" Grace took her daughter's small, warm hand. She had no answer. The first night was the hardest. Grace found a sheltered spot between 2 buildings where the wind didn't hit directly. She spread cardboard on the ground and covered Chloe with all the coats they had. "It's like camping," she lied, lying down next to her daughter. "Remember when we saw it in the movie?" Chloe nodded, but Grace saw the tremble in her lips. It wasn't just from the cold. During the night, she woke up several times to check if Chloe was still breathing. The temperature had plummeted, and the girl was too pale. Grace pulled her closer, sharing her own body heat. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she murmured in her daughter's ear. "Mommy promises." But promises didn't provide warmth, and lies didn't provide food. On the second day, Grace went back to the diner where she had worked until the previous week. Not to ask for her job back, she knew there was no chance. The owner had fired her when he found out she was arriving late because she didn't have money for the bus. She waited outside until Sarah, the cook, came out for her break. "Grace? My God, what happened to you?" "We were evicted." Grace didn't have the energy to come up with a better story. "Sarah, could you... Is there any food that's going to be thrown out?" Sarah looked around and motioned for Grace to wait. She returned 5 minutes later with a bag. "Burgers that got cold and fries from lunch. It's not much, but it's perfect." Grace clutched the bag to her chest. "Thank you so much." "Grace, you need help." "There are shelters for families." "Oh, I'm fine." The lie came out too quickly. "We just need a few days." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. Grace found Chloe exactly where she had left her, sitting on the cardboard, drawing with a broken crayon on a crumpled piece of paper. The girl looked up when she saw her. "I brought food," Chloe smiled, the first genuine smile in 2 days. They shared the cold burger and limp fries as if it were a feast. "It's yummy, Mommy." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat along with the food. "Tomorrow we'll find a better place," she said, knowing it was another lie, but Chloe believed everything she said. That blind trust was both what kept Grace going and what haunted her the most. On the 3rd day, it rained. Grace carried Chloe in her arms, searching for shelter. The girl was coughing, and her little body was warm, too warm. They found a space under a fire escape, but the rain still reached them. Grace took off her own coat and wrapped it around her daughter, leaving herself in just a thin shirt. Within minutes, she was soaked and shivering. "Mommy, you're cold." "No, I'm okay." Chloe studied her mother's face with those blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "Can I share the coat with you?" Grace almost broke down right there. Instead, she hugged her daughter tighter. "We're a team, aren't we?" "Forever," Chloe replied, as she always did. At night, Grace couldn't sleep. Chloe had a fever and was murmuring nonsense in her sleep. Every breath seemed like an effort. Grace looked out at the empty streets, lit only by distant lampposts. How many other people were going through this right now? How many children were cold, hungry, scared? She thought of her husband, Michael. If he were alive, none of this would have happened. He always knew how to manage, always found a way. But a car accident took more than his life. It took their security. "Please," she murmured to the dark sky. She didn't know who she was asking, but she had to try. "So I don't let anything happen to her. You can take everything from me, but not her." The wind blew harder, as if in response. On the fourth day, Grace went back to the diner. This time, Sarah wasn't outside. She waited an hour until another employee came out. "Excuse me, is there any food that can't help you?" the young man said, without looking at her. The boss said not to give anything to beggars. The word cut like a knife of beggars. That's what they were now. Grace returned to Chloe empty-handed. The girl didn't complain, just asked if they would find food later. Grace said yes, but she had no idea how. That night, Chloe asked Grace to tell the story of the princess who lived in a big castle and was never cold. Grace invented details about long dresses, fireplaces that never went out, and tables filled with food. "Will we live in a place like that one day?" Chloe asked. "One day," Grace promised, once again. On the fifth day, everything changed. Grace woke up and Chloe wasn't moving. Her little body was very hot and she was breathing strangely, fast and shallow. "Chloe! Chloe, wake up!" The girl opened her eyes, but she didn't seem to recognize where she was. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." Grace had no water. She had nothing. She picked Chloe up and started walking. She had to find help, no matter her pride. Nothing mattered but saving her daughter. The streets were full of people heading to work, all in a hurry, all looking straight ahead. Grace tried to stop a few, but they averted their eyes and quickened their pace. "Please," she yelled to a well-dressed woman, "my daughter is sick." The woman clutched her purse tighter and crossed the street. Grace kept walking, Chloe heavy in her arms. Every step was an effort, but she couldn't stop. Not now. It was then that she saw a figure in the distance, walking alone on the sidewalk, a tall man in a dark coat. Something about him was different from the others. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. Grace took a deep breath and headed toward him. It was her last chance. She didn't know she was about to meet Matthew and that this meeting would change everything. Matthew Harper walked down the empty avenue, his hands buried in the pockets of his Italian wool coat. It was almost midnight, and the temperature had dropped to numbers that made people rush home. He was in no hurry to get anywhere. The mansion was empty, as always. The housekeeper had left at 6 and leaving dinner prepared in the fridge, a dinner he probably wouldn't eat. The silent rooms awaited him, along with another night of interrupted sleep and dreams that never came. At 35, Matthew had everything money could buy, companies, properties, cars that cost more than entire houses, but he walked the cold streets because his $5 million house felt like a gilded prison. The wind cut his face, and he pulled up the collar of his coat. Maybe he should have taken the car, or better yet, he should have stayed home working on the quarterly reports. That's when he saw the figure staggering toward him. Grace felt her legs failing with each step. Chloe was too heavy, or maybe she was too weak. The girl had stopped shivering an hour ago, which was more frightening than the shivering. "Mommy," Chloe murmured against her neck. "It's so cold." "I know, sweetie. We'll find a warm place." It was lie number 67 since they'd left their home. Grace had stopped counting after 50. The street was almost deserted. Just a few people rushing to their cars, eager to escape the cold. No one looked at her, no one cared about a woman carrying a child in the middle of the night, until she saw the man. He walked slowly, unhurriedly, as if the cold didn't bother him. He wore expensive clothes. Grace could still recognize quality when she saw it. A dark suit under the coat, shoes that shone even in the dim light of the street lamps. Rich, very rich. Grace hesitated. Rich men were usually the ones who looked away from people like her the most, but this one was different. He wasn't on the phone, not looking at his watch, just walking, lost in thought. She took a deep breath and ran toward him. "Excuse me, please." Matthew looked up, surprised. A blonde woman was running toward him, stumbling from her own exhaustion. She was carrying a child. Grace stopped 10 feet from him, panting. The man was taller than he had seemed from a distance, with dark hair and eyes that studied her without immediate judgment. That was already better than most. "Please," she managed to say between heavy breaths. "Could you? My daughter is sick." Matthew looked at the child. The girl had blonde hair like her mother, but her skin was too pale, and he could hear her labored breathing even from where he stood. "You need a hospital," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "No!" Grace yelled, louder than she intended. I can't afford it, and if they find out we're living on the street, they'll take her from me." Matthew paused with the phone in his hand. He studied the woman's face, the desperate eyes, the dirty but still carefully kept clothes, the way she held her daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Son, how long have you been on the street?" 5 days. The answer came out as a whisper. "And before that?" "We lived in a small room. The rent went up. I couldn't pay it." Matthew nodded. It wasn't the first time he'd heard this story. The city was full of people being pushed out of their homes by impossible rent hikes. The difference was he had never seen the problem up close like this. "What's your name?" "Grace, as Grace Coleman, and this is Chloe." As if hearing her own name, Chloe opened her blue eyes and looked at Matthew. There was no fear there, just weary curiosity. "Hi," she said in a raspy voice. "Hi, Chloe." Matthew didn't know why he answered. He usually avoided any unnecessary interaction with strangers. But there was something about that little girl that made him forget his own rules. Grace saw his expression soften when Chloe spoke. This was her chance, maybe her only one. "I know this is going to sound crazy," she began, the words tumbling out in desperation. "But could you adopt my daughter?" Matthew blinked, kind of surprised. "I can't take care of her anymore," Grace continued, her words running together. "She's getting sick, she's hungry, and I have nowhere to live. I have nothing to offer her." "Mommy!" Chloe looked at Grace with confusion. "You seem like a good person," Grace said, ignoring her daughter's gaze. "You have money, you have a warm house. She could have a better life with you." Matthew was silent for a long moment. He looked at Grace, then at Chloe, then at the empty street around them. "You don't really want to give up your daughter," he said finally. Grace began to cry. Not the dramatic sobs she'd been holding back for days, but silent tears that streamed down her face without permission. "I don't want to," she admitted, "but if she stays with me, she could die. And if she dies, it will be my fault." Matthew had seen desperation before, in business meetings, when executives pleaded for more time to pay off debts, in employees begging not to be fired, but he had never seen anything like this, a mother willing to give away her own child to save her. Matthew stood in the middle of the street. The weight of the situation fell on him like a cold wave. A desperate mother, a sick child, and him with all the money in the world but no idea how to use it for something that truly mattered. "I have a big house," he heard himself say. "You could both stay there tonight." Grace looked up, surprised. "I can't accept that," she said immediately. "I don't know you." "Mommy," Chloe murmured against Grace's neck. "I'm so cold." Matthew saw the internal struggle on Grace's face, the instinct to protect her daughter fighting with the fear of the unknown. "It's just a warm place for the night," he said. "There are empty rooms, heating food. You can leave in the morning if you want." Grace looked at Chloe, who was shivering even though she was wrapped in all their coats. "A few blocks from here?" she asked. "Yes." Grace took a deep breath. "Just for tonight." "Just for tonight," Matthew agreed. The mansion appeared before them like something out of a fairy tale. Grace stopped at the entrance, intimidated. Chloe lifted her head from her mother's shoulder, and her blue eyes widened. "Wow," she whispered. "It's so big," Grace said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Sometimes too big," Matthew admitted, opening the front door. The entryway was larger than the entire room they used to live in. Marble floors, a chandelier that sparkled like diamonds, stairs that curved elegantly up to the second floor. "Do you live here all by yourself?" Chloe asked, her voice echoing in the immense space. "All by myself," Matthew confirmed. "Isn't it haunted?" Grace blushed. "Chloe, but Matthew almost smiled. A little. Especially at night. He led them to a room on the second floor. Grace entered slowly, as if afraid of breaking something. The bed was huge, covered with sheets that looked softer than anything she had ever touched. "The bathroom is through there," Matthew pointed. "There's hot water and clean towels. You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," he interrupted Grace gently. "You need a safe place." Chloe slid out of her mother's arms and ran to the window. "Mommy, look, there's a giant garden." Grace walked over to her daughter. Below, under the lamplight, stretched a garden that seemed to have no end. Trees, flowers that held some color even in winter, stone paths that disappeared into the darkness. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "You can explore it tomorrow," Matthew said, "if you want." Chloe turned to him, her eyes shining. "Can we really?" "Of course." Grace felt a lump in her throat. It had been so long since Chloe had shown excitement about anything. So long since she'd seen her daughter act like a normal child. "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked, looking directly at Matthew. He was silent for a moment, studying her face. There was sincerity there, and a strength he hadn't expected to find in someone who had lost everything. "Because I can," he said finally. "And because you need it." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was what he could admit at that moment. The truth was, for the first time in years, he had a chance to do something that actually mattered. "Thank you," Grace said, and there was so much weight in that single word that Matthew felt something tighten in his chest. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." "I know it means a lot," he replied. Chloe ran to him and, before Matthew could react, hugged his legs tightly. "Thank you for saving us," she mumbled against his expensive suit. Matthew looked down at the girl's messy blonde hair and felt something he couldn't identify. It was as if a frozen piece inside him was beginning to thaw. "You're welcome," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace gently pulled Chloe back. "We'll let you get some rest." "Matthew," he corrected. "You can call me Matthew." "Matthew," Chloe repeated, testing the name. "I like that name." "I like your name too, Chloe." The girl smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole pale face. When Matthew left the room and closed the door, he paused in the hallway for a moment. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. No longer empty and oppressive, but full of possibilities. From the other side of the door, he could hear Chloe asking questions about the big bed and Grace laughing. The first genuine laugh she'd managed in days. Matthew went down to his office, but instead of working, he stood looking out the window at the garden. Tomorrow, a 5-year-old girl would run along those paths for the first time in decades. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. He didn't know it yet, but that cold night had changed everything. The house that had always been just a place to store his things now held something much more valuable: hope. Matthew woke to a sound he couldn't identify. He lay still in the king-sized bed, trying to figure out what it was. After a few seconds, he recognized it. Voices. Voices in his house. For a moment, he completely forgot about the previous night. His first reaction was to grab his phone and call security. Then it all came back to him. Grace, Chloe, the biting cold, the small, tight hug on his legs. They were still here. He looked at the clock. 7:30 in the morning. He usually woke up at 6 and showered, put on a suit, and headed to the office without breakfast. The routine was always the same: silence, efficiency, solitude. But now there were voices coming from the kitchen. Matthew got up slowly, put on a robe, and went downstairs. The smell that greeted him made him stop halfway down the stairs. Bacon, eggs, fresh coffee. When was the last time his house had smelled like real food? Grace was standing at the stove, scrambling eggs in a pan. She was wearing the same clothes as the night before, but she had washed her face and combed her hair. Chloe was sitting on the kitchen counter, swinging her legs and telling a story about a unicorn that lived in a candy forest. "And then the unicorn found a chocolate house," Chloe said excitedly. "I bet he couldn't eat it because then the house would collapse." "What a dilemma," Grace laughed, flipping the bacon in the pan. "What do you think he should do?" "Eat just one tiny little piece. That way the house won't fall down and he won't be hungry. Good idea, you're very smart. Matthew stood in the kitchen doorway watching the scene. It was like watching a movie of a life he never had. The morning light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the blonde hair of the mother and daughter. The sound of their conversation echoed through the space that had always been silent. "Good morning," he said, finally making his presence known. Grace turned, startled. "Matthew, I'm sorry, I thought you were still asleep." "It's no problem." He entered the kitchen, still trying to process the transformation. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to say thank you," Grace said, looking down. "It's the least I can do after everything you've done for us." Chloe hopped off the counter and ran to Matthew. "Hi, Mommy's making breakfast." "Do you like scrambled eggs?" "I do," Matthew replied, surprised by the direct question. "Me too. And bacon. And pancakes. My mom makes the best pancakes in the world." Grace blushed. "Chloe, it's true. She worked at a diner, and everyone said her pancakes were the best." Matthew looked at Grace with curiosity. "You worked at a diner?" "I did," Grace confirmed, focusing on the eggs to avoid his gaze. "Until last week." They sat at the dining room table, a huge mahogany table that Matthew only used when hosting important clients. Grace placed the plates down carefully as if afraid of breaking something. "This table is giant," Chloe observed, climbing onto her chair. "How many people can sit here?" 12, Matthew answered. "Wow, do you always eat alone at a table for 12 people?" "Chloe," Grace warned gently. "It's okay," Matthew said. "And yes, I always eat alone." "Isn't that sad?" Matthew paused with his fork in the air. The question from a 5-year-old had cut straight to the point he had avoided thinking about for years. "Sometimes," he admitted. "You're not alone anymore," Chloe declared, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Now there are 3 of us." Grace almost choked on her coffee. "Chloe, we're only here for today, remember?" "Oh." Chloe's face fell a little. "That's right." Matthew watched the interaction in silence. There was something about the girl's disappointment that bothered him more than it should have. "The food is delicious," he said, changing the subject. "Thank you. Cooking always relaxes me." Grace took a sip of coffee. "I learned when I was little. My mum worked 2 jobs, so I took care of the house. And your father. Never knew him." Grace spoke without bitterness. Just as a matter of fact, it was just me and my mum. "How is she?" "She passed away when I was 18, cancer." Matthew nodded, understanding the trajectory. "And after that?" "After that, I got by however I could. Worked in various diners, a few restaurants. I met Michael when I was 22. "My daddy," Chloe interrupted. "He was a firefighter." Grace smiled, but Matthew saw the sadness in her eyes. "Yes, he was. A very brave firefighter. He died saving people," Chloe continued, with the simple pride of a child. "So our mommy says he's a hero." "He is a hero," Grace corrected gently. Matthew felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm sorry." "It's been 2 years," Grace said. "Chloe was still very young. She doesn't fully understand." "Yes, I do," Chloe protested. "Daddy is in heaven watching over us." Grace stroked her daughter's hair. "Ah, yes, he is, sweetie." "And after he passed?" Matthew asked, genuinely interested. It was hard. Grace pushed the food around on her plate. "Michael had a small life insurance policy. It lasted about 6 months. After that, it was just one job after another." "At the diner where you worked until last week?" "That was my 3rd time working there. The owner fired me because I was sometimes late." Grace hesitated. "I didn't have money for the bus and would walk. It took almost an hour." Matthew did the math in his head. An hour's walk meant at least 3 miles every day, with a 5-year-old child to care for and the apartment. "Room," Grace corrected. "It was just a small room. We shared a bathroom with 3 other families, but it was clean and safe, until the rent went up. From $400 to $800 overnight." Grace gave a bitter laugh. "As if I could just pull an extra $400 out of thin air." Matthew knew the process. Gentrification, they called it. Old neighborhoods being renovated, Prices soaring, poor families being pushed out. It was good for business, for urban development. He had even invested in a few projects like that himself. He had never stopped to think about what happened to the people who couldn't keep up with the new prices. And now, he asked, now I'll look for a job. And a place to live. Grace sat up straighter in her chair, showing a determination that Matthew admired. I won't be on the street again, not with Chloe. Mommy will figure it out, Chloe said with absolute confidence. She always does. Matthew looked at Grace, really looked. He saw the dark circles under her eyes that no makeup could hide, the clothes that tried to look presentable despite being the only ones she had. He also saw the straight posture, the lifted chin, the refusal to let herself be broken. What's your experience in besides being a waitress? Cleaning, organizing, cooking. I've also taken care of children. Grace shrugged. I'll take any honest work. Anything. Anything. Matthew nodded but said nothing. An idea was beginning to form in his mind, but it was too soon to talk about it. After breakfast, Grace insisted on washing the dishes. Matthew tried to protest, but she was adamant. It's the least I can do. Chloe, meanwhile, had discovered the rest of the house. Matthew could hear her running through the hallways, her small footsteps echoing through the empty space. Every now and then she would shout, "Wow!" or "Look at this, Mommy," always discovering something new. Sorry, Grace said from the kitchen. She's not used to so much space. It's no problem. And to his own surprise, it really wasn't. Matthew headed to his office to check emails, but stopped when he saw Chloe in the hallway. She was standing in front of one of the walls, studying something with concentration. What are you looking at? He asked. This wall is very empty, she said, as if it were obvious. There are no drawings or pictures or anything. Matthew looked at the wall. It was true. All the walls in the house were bare. He had never stopped to think about it. Do you have any paper? Chloe asked. Paper? To draw. I can make some drawings for your walls, so it won't be so sad. Matthew was speechless for a moment. I think I have some paper in the office. Chloe's eyes lit up. Can I see? Matthew's office was a sanctuary of efficiency. A huge desk, computers, files organized with military precision. Chloe entered as if she were exploring a mysterious cave. Do you work here? I do. Doing what? Business. Matthew realized the answer meant nothing to a 5-year-old. I buy and sell companies. Like stores? Like stores. Chloe nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. Matthew grabbed a stack of printer paper and some colored pens he used for meetings. Will this work? Perfect. Chloe sat on the floor and immediately began to draw. I'm going to make a happy family. Matthew watched her for a few minutes. The lines were simple, like any 5-year-old's, but there was something captivating about her concentration. Her tongue stuck out a little when she focused on the details. Done, she announced after a few minutes. Matthew looked at the drawing. 3 stick figures in front of a huge house, a woman with yellow hair, a smaller child also with yellow hair, and a tall man with dark hair. Who are they? It's us, Chloe said as if it were obvious. You, me, and Mommy. At your house. Matthew studied the drawing more closely. He was in the middle, holding both of their hands. Everyone was smiling. It's for you, Chloe said, holding out the paper. So you don't forget us when we leave. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity that Matthew wasn't used to seeing in his house. Chloe made 4 more drawings, which she taped to the walls with adhesive tape she found in a drawer. Grace organized the kitchen, folded some towels that were lying around in the guest bathroom, and even fluffed the pillows in the living room. Pillows Matthew didn't even know were messy. Around noon he noticed something strange. The house was different. Not just because there were people in it, but because for the first time in years it felt alive. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sounds of life, Chloe humming as she drew, Grace singing softly in the kitchen, the noise of footsteps, of doors opening and closing, of a house truly being lived in. When Grace brought him a glass of juice in his office, Matthew noticed she had found flowers in the garden and put them in a makeshift vase on the coffee table. He didn't even know there were flowers in the garden. You didn't have to, he began. I know, Grace interrupted, but I wanted to. It makes the house feel cozier. Cozy. Matthew repeated the word in his head. When was the last time someone had described his house as cozy? In the afternoon, while Chloe napped on the living room sofa. She had insisted she didn't want to sleep in the bedroom, she wanted to sleep where she could see everyone. Matthew found Grace in the kitchen preparing something that smelled incredibly good. So what are you making? Soup. Grace didn't look up from the pot. I found some vegetables in the fridge. I hope you don't mind. I don't mind. He leaned against the counter. Grace. Yes? Why are you doing all this? She finally looked at him. What? Cooking, cleaning, organizing? You didn't have to. Grace went back to stirring the soup. Yes, I do. You gave us a roof, food, safety. It's the least I can do to repay you. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. She turned to him completely. You saved our lives last night. Literally. I don't know if I could have handled another night on the street. Matthew was silent, processing her words. Besides, Grace continued, turning back to the soup, I like taking care of things. I always have. It makes life feel more, I don't know, more normal. Normal. Another word Matthew hadn't associated with his life in a long time. When Chloe woke up, she ran to the kitchen and asked if she could help prepare dinner. Grace set her on a chair in front of the counter and gave her some carrots to chop with a plastic knife. Matthew watched them work together, Grace patiently guiding as Chloe concentrated intensely on the task. It was such a domestic, normal scene that he felt like a stranger in his own house. But it was a good kind of strangeness. Matthew, Chloe called out without looking up from the carrots, are you going to have dinner with us? If you want me to. Of course we do. Chloe smiled at him. Food tastes better when you eat it with other people. Who told you that? Nobody, I just know. She went back to the carrots. It's true. Matthew looked at Grace, who smiled shyly. Yes, she has some very strong theories about life. It seems she's right about most of them, and for the first time in a long time, Matthew was looking forward to dinner. As Grace finished cooking, Matthew found himself thinking about what would happen the next day. Grace had said she would look for a job and a place to live. It was the plan. It was logical. But as he looked at Chloe's drawings on the wall, at the flowers Grace had placed on the table, at the kitchen that finally looked like a real kitchen, Matthew realized he didn't want them to leave. He didn't know exactly why yet. He just knew that, for the first time in years, his house didn't feel like a gilded prison. It felt like a home. And he wasn't ready to go back to the silence. It was the third day at the mansion, and a routine had settled in naturally. Grace would wake up early, make breakfast, and Matthew would come downstairs to find the table set and the aroma of home-cooked food filling the house. Chloe would run through the hallways, turning every quiet corner into a place full of life. That morning, Matthew came down later than usual. He had stayed up late thinking about things that didn't normally bother him, like the fact that his house had 15 bedrooms and he only used one. How he'd never noticed the garden had flowers until Grace put some in a vase. How the silence he once considered peace now felt empty. "Good morning," Chloe shouted when she saw him, running to hug his legs as she had for the past 2 days. "Good morning, Chloe. Mommy made pancakes, the best in the world." Grace smiled from the kitchen. "She exaggerates." "It's not an exaggeration," Matthew said, sitting at the table. "They are really very good." It was true. For the past 3 days, he had eaten better than he had in the last 3 years, not just because the food was good, but because there was something special about eating with other people, about listening to Chloe tell stories while Grace listened with genuine attention. "Matthew," Chloe said, swinging her legs in the high chair he had ordered for her. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Have you always lived alone in this big house?" The question was asked with the simple curiosity of a child, but it hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. Grace stopped eating and looked at her daughter with that expression mothers make when they know their child has just touched on a sensitive subject. "Always alone," Matthew answered, his voice lower than he intended. "Always. Always." Chloe tilted her head, studying his face with those blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "But don't you get sad?" Grace intervened quickly. Chloe, don't ask personal questions. It's okay, Matthew said, though it wasn't okay. The girl's simple question had opened a wound he didn't even know was still bleeding. It does get sad sometimes. Why didn't you get a family? Chloe, Grace whispered, mortified. But Matthew held up a hand. There was something in the innocence of the question that deserved an honest answer. I never knew how, he said finally. Carson, what do you mean? Matthew looked at Grace, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if giving him permission to continue. When you grow up without a family, sometimes you don't learn how to have one. You grew up without a family. I did. Chloe stopped eating completely, all her attention focused on him. Without a mom or a dad. Without anyone. The girl was silent for a moment, processing the information. Then, with the determination only a 5-year-old can have, she got down from her chair and ran to Matthew. You have us now, she said, hugging him. After breakfast, Grace sent Chloe to play in the garden while she finished cleaning the kitchen. Matthew sat at the table, still processing the conversation. He hadn't spoken about his childhood in years, to anyone. I'm sorry, Grace said, not looking at him. She doesn't understand that some questions. You don't need to apologize. Matthew watched her wash the dishes with the same care she did everything. She was just being honest. Sometimes the honesty of children can be brutal. It can. He paused. But it can also be necessary. Grace turned to him, her hands still wet with soapy water. Did you really grow up without a family? It was her turn to ask personal questions. Matthew should have been bothered, but he wasn't. My parents died when I was 8. A car accident? The words came out easier than he expected. I had no other relatives. I went to an orphanage. Grace dried her hands and sat at the table, across from him. That must have been terrible. It was. Matthew looked out the window, where Chloe was chasing a butterfly in the garden. I was there until I was 18. Then I was on my own. And you built all of this on your own. I did. He turned his gaze back to her. But building wealth is easier than building other things. Grace nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. And you? Matthew asked. Chloe mentioned her father yesterday, but... Grace's face closed off a bit, but not in a hostile way. It was the expression of someone preparing to touch a still sensitive wound. Michael, she said simply. My husband. He passed away 2 years ago. 2 years and 3 months ago. The precision in her answer showed she still counted the days. Chloe had just turned 3. Matthew waited for her to continue, not wanting to force the conversation. Grace was silent for a moment, looking at her own hands. When she spoke again, her voice was low but steady. He was a firefighter. He went out on an emergency call one night and never came back. I'm so sorry. It was a building on fire. He managed to save 2 families before... She paused, taking a deep breath. Died before the roof collapsed. Matthew felt something tighten in his chest. He was a hero. He was. Grace smiled, but it was a sad smile. Chloe is right when she says that. He always put others before himself. It must have been very hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through. Grace finally looked at him. Not just because I loved him, but because I suddenly found myself alone with a small child, not knowing how to move forward. But you did. I had no choice. Chloe needed me. Matthew watched her face as she spoke. There was a strength there that he admired, a determination that went beyond anything he knew. Grace had lost everything and still found the strength to start over every day. And you? She asked, interrupting his thoughts. Never married? Never wanted to have kids? The question caught Matthew off guard. He could have given an evasive answer, changed the subject, maintained the distance he always kept with everyone. But there was something in the way Grace looked at him, without judgment, just with genuine curiosity, that made him want to be honest. I never knew how, he repeated the answer he had given Chloe. When you grow up without seeing how a family works, it's hard to imagine how to create one. But you must have had relationships, A few. Matthew paused. Say, but I always kept my distance. It was easier that way. Easier how? Easier not to get attached, not to risk losing someone again. Grace nodded slowly. I understand. You do. After Michael died, I spent a long time trying not to get attached to anything but Chloe. Because if you don't get attached, you can't get hurt again. They were silent for a moment, the weight of mutual understanding hanging between them. But that's not really living, Grace continued. It's just surviving. Matthew looked at her with renewed attention. That was exactly what he had been doing for years, surviving. Working, making money, buying things, but never really living. How did you get past that? Chloe, the answer was immediate. She forced me to keep living. Children don't understand survival. They only know how to live. From the garden came the sound of Chloe singing a song she had made up about butterflies that lived in castles. Grace smiled when she heard it. She's always been like that, she said. Even when we were being evicted, even when we were sleeping on the street, she would find something to celebrate. A beautiful star, a friendly dog, a smile from a stranger. It must have been terrible for you seeing her go through that. It was. Grace swallowed hard. But it also showed me how strong she is. How strong we both are. Matthew thought of the last few nights, listening to Chloe laugh before bed, watching Grace find beauty in the garden flowers he never knew existed. They truly were strong in a way he had never learned to be. You admire her, Grace observed, following his gaze toward the garden. I admire you both. Why? Because you lost everything and yet, Matthew searched for the right words. You still managed to find joy in the little things. You can make a house feel like a home in a matter of days. Grace blushed slightly. We didn't do anything special. Yes, you did. Matthew leaned forward. Waitress, you made this house feel alive for the first time in 20 years. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people recognize each other on a deep level, when they realize they share something more fundamental than just circumstances. Matthew, Grace said finally. Yes. Thank you for letting us stay. I know it wasn't your plan when you brought us here. It wasn't, he admitted. But now I can't imagine the house without you. The confession slipped out before he could censor it. Grace looked at him with surprise, then with something Matthew couldn't immediately identify. We can't imagine being anywhere else either, she said softly. Really? Even after everything you've been through, especially after everything we've been through. Grace looked around the kitchen, then back at him. You gave us more than shelter, Matthew. You gave us hope. Chloe appeared at the kitchen door just then, her hair messy from running in the garden, her cheeks rosy from exercise. What are you two doing inside on such a beautiful day? Talking, Grace answered. About what? Matthew and Grace looked at each other. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that two adults were discovering they weren't so different after all? That they had both spent years protecting themselves from pain, and that maybe, just maybe, they were ready to stop just surviving. About how nice it is to have friends, Matthew said finally. Are you guys friends? We are, Grace confirmed, looking at Matthew with a smile that he returned. That's good. Friends take care of each other. That's true, Matthew agreed. And friends don't let friends be lonely in big, sad houses. Grace laughed. Where did you learn that? I just made it up. Chloe shrugged as if it were obvious. Can I have some juice? As Grace prepared the juice, Matthew thought about Chloe's words. Friends don't let friends be lonely. It was a simple, yet profound philosophy. For years, he had convinced himself that he preferred solitude, that it was safer, simpler, more controllable. But in the last 3 days, he had discovered something he didn't know he was missing. Companionship. Not just the physical presence of other people, but real connection, mutual understanding, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. Later that day, after lunch, Matthew found Grace in the library, flipping through a book of architectural photography. Chloe was napping on the living room sofa, exhausted from her morning exploration of the garden. Find anything interesting? He asked. This house is incredible, Grace said, closing the book. Did you design it? No, I bought it as is. Matthew sat in the armchair next to her. Actually, I never really cared much about what it looked like. It was just big. And now? Now I'm starting to notice the details. It was true. In the last few days, he had noticed things he had never seen before. The way the light came through the living room window in the morning, the sound his footsteps made on the marble floor in the hall, the view of the garden from the kitchen window. It's funny, Grace said, how your perspective changes when you're not just trying to survive. Is that what we're doing? Changing perspectives. Grace looked him straight in the eye. I think so, don't you? Matthew thought about the question. 3 days ago, his life was predictable, controlled, safe and empty. Now it was different. He didn't know how to define that difference yet, but he knew he didn't want to go back to how things were. I think so, he agreed. And for the first time in years, Matthew Harper didn't feel alone in the world. That night at dinner, Chloe made another one of her direct observations. Matthew, you seem less sad today. I do. You do. Your eyes are brighter. Grace smiled. She always notices these things. And you, Mommy, you're smiling more. Am I? You are. I like it when you really smile, not just to be polite. Matthew looked at Grace and realized Chloe was right. Her smile was different now, more relaxed, more genuine. I think we're all happier, he said. Because we're a family now, Chloe declared. Grace choked on her water. Chloe, we've talked about this, but it's true. Families are people who take care of each other and love each other. We do that. Matthew looked at the two of them, Grace trying to gently explain that the situation was temporary, Chloe insisting with the relentless logic of a child that family is about love, not blood. And he realized that, perhaps for the first time in his life, the child was right. They really did seem like a family, and that didn't scare him as much as it should have. It was a Thursday morning when Matthew made the decision that would change everything. He was in his office, pretending to read financial reports, but actually watching Grace in the garden. She had taken Chloe outside to play, and they were running between the trees, laughing about something he couldn't hear. In the last 5 days, since their conversation in the kitchen, something had changed in the dynamic of the house. It wasn't just that they were there, it was as if they had always been. Grace knew the routine better than his own housekeeper. Chloe knew exactly where the glasses were in the kitchen. They had become part of that place in a way Matthew hadn't known was possible, but he also knew it couldn't last forever. Grace had never said anything, but Matthew saw a growing concern in her eyes. She was grateful, but she was also feeling like a burden. Every day they spent there was another day of dependence, and Matthew knew Grace well enough to know that it bothered her deeply. She was a proud woman, a woman who wanted to work, support her daughter, have her own life, and he respected that about her. That's when he had the idea. Matthew picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. James Richardson. James, it's Matthew. Matthew, long time no see, how are you? James Richardson was one of the few people Matthew considered a true friend. They had met in college and, over the years, had kept in touch despite their busy lives. James ran a rapidly growing digital marketing company, exactly the kind of place that would need someone with Grace's work ethic. I'm good. Actually, I'm calling because I need a favor. Of course. What do you need? Matthew hesitated for a moment. How could he explain the situation without sounding like he was trying to push an unqualified person onto a friend? I met a woman who's looking for a job. She has customer service experience. She's extremely responsible and hardworking. I thought you might be interested. What kind of experience does she have? She's worked in restaurants and diners for years, always in positions with direct customer contact. She's punctual, organized, and... Matthew paused, realizing he was speaking with an enthusiasm that might seem suspicious. She's a good person, James. Someone you can trust. All right. You can tell her to call and set up an interview. We're actually looking for someone in customer service. Thanks, James. This means a lot. No problem. But, Matthew, are you okay? You sound different. Matthew looked out the window again. Grace was pushing Chloe on a swing he didn't even know existed in the garden. "I am different," he admitted, "but it's a good change." When Grace and Chloe came back from the garden, Matthew found them in the kitchen. Grace was preparing lunch while Chloe drew at the table, her hair still messy from the wind. "Grace," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, "can I talk to you?" "Of course." She turned down the heat on the stove. "Chloe, you stay here and draw, okay?" "Okay." Grace followed him into the living room, wiping her hands on an apron she'd found in a kitchen drawer. Matthew noticed she always did that when she was nervous, wiped her hands even when they were already dry. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Actually, yes, something good." Matthew sat on the edge of the sofa. "I called a friend of mine this morning, James Richardson. He has a digital marketing company." Grace frowned, confused. "Okay. They're looking for someone in customer service. Good salary, benefits, regular business hours. I thought you might be interested." Grace's face changed completely. First surprise, then understanding, then something Matthew couldn't immediately identify. You found a job for me." "Not exactly. I found an opportunity." "The decision to hire you is still theirs." Grace was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because you need to work, and because I know you'll be great in this position." "Matthew..." Grace sat down too, her hands clasped in her lap. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll call him." "Thank you," Grace said, and there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." "I do have an idea," Matthew replied, and he really did. He knew what it meant to take pride in your own work, to be able to support yourself. Grace stood up quickly and, before Matthew could react, hugged him. It wasn't a long or romantic hug, it was the hug of someone genuinely grateful, someone who had been given hope when she needed it most. "I'll call him right now," she said, pulling away. Grace." "Yes. You're going to get this job." "I'm sure of it," she smiled, that radiant smile that appeared when she was truly happy. "I hope so." Grace called James that same afternoon. Matthew stayed in his office, trying to work, but actually listening to the conversation happening in the next room. He only heard fragments, Grace explaining her experience, asking about the company, thanking him for the opportunity. After 20 minutes, she hung up. "So," Matthew asked, appearing in the room. "Interview tomorrow at 2 p.m., Grace said, and there was an energy in her that Matthew hadn't seen since the first day. He seemed interested. "Of course he did. You're perfect for the job. I don't know about that, but Matthew, thank you so much. Even if it doesn't work out, thank you for trying." "It will work out." Chloe came running from the kitchen. "Mommy, why are you crying?" "I'm not crying, sweetie. I'm happy." "Why?" Grace looked at Matthew, asking for permission with her eyes. "Because Mommy might get a new job," he said. "A very good job, and that's great." "Let's celebrate." "Celebrate how?" Grace asked, laughing. "By baking a cake. Matthew, do you like cake?" "I do," Matthew replied, though he hadn't eaten cake in years. "Then, let's make the best cake in the world." The next morning, Grace got ready for the interview. Matthew lent her money to buy a suitable outfit, a simple blazer and a skirt that made her look like the competent professional she had always been. "How do I look?" she asked nervously, adjusting the blazer for the 10th time. "Perfect," Matthew answered, and he was being completely honest. Grace was radiant. There was a confidence in her that went beyond the new clothes. It was the confidence of someone who had a real chance to start her life over. "Mommy, you look beautiful," Chloe declared, appearing in the living room. "Thank you, sweetie. You're going to get the job. I know you will." "How do you know?" "Because you're the best mommy in the world." "And people will see that." Grace hugged her daughter, and Matthew saw tears in her eyes. "I'll be back in a few hours," she said. "We'll be here," Matthew replied. The next 3 hours were the longest of Matthew's life. He tried to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Chloe was restless too, asking every 5 minutes what time it was and when her mom would be back. When Grace finally returned, Matthew knew from her face that it had gone well before she even spoke. "I got it," she said, and her voice was filled with a happiness Matthew hadn't heard in days. "I got the job." "Mommy!" Chloe shouted, running to hug her. "Congratulations," Matthew said, trying to sound more excited than he felt. "James is a really nice guy." "And the job, Matthew, it's perfect. Good salary, benefits, a schedule that lets me pick Chloe up from school. It's more than I could have ever dreamed of." Matthew watched Grace's illuminated face and felt a strange mix of pride and something he couldn't identify. It was as if he were watching something wonderful and terrible at the same time. "See, I'm very happy for you," he said, and it was true. He was genuinely happy for her. "I start on Monday." "So soon?" "They need someone urgently." Grace paused, as if she had just realized something. "That means I'll have to find an apartment quickly." "You don't have to rush," Matthew said quickly. "You can stay here until you find something suitable." Grace was silent for a moment, studying his face. "Matthew," she said finally, "you've already done so much for us. Now I need to go it alone." The words hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. Of course Grace wanted to go it alone. She was independent, proud, strong. That was exactly what he admired about her. So why did it feel like the floor had just disappeared from under his feet? "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I am." Grace took a deep breath. "You've done so much for us. You saved our lives, gave us a roof, food, hope. Now it's time for us to be independent again." "I understand. I'll look for an apartment tomorrow and over the weekend. On Monday I start work and maybe by Wednesday we'll be settled." 3 days. In 3 days they would be out of his life. "Of course," Matthew said. "That makes sense." But it didn't make any sense at all. Nothing about them leaving made sense to him. Chloe, who had been jumping for joy, suddenly stopped when she processed the conversation. "Wait," she said, looking from Grace to Matthew. "We're leaving." "We are, sweetie. We're going to have our own little home. But I like it here, and Matthew is going to be all alone again." Grace knelt down to her daughter's level. "Matthew has his life, Chloe, and we have ours. But no buts. We're going to be happy with our new life." Chloe looked at Matthew with those blue eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. "Do you want us to leave?" she asked. The girl's direct question left Matthew speechless for a moment. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that he didn't want them to leave, but that he also understood it was the right thing to do? "I want you to be happy," he said finally, "but won't you be sad?" "I'll miss you," Matthew admitted. "Then why don't you ask them to stay?" The innocence of the question cut Matthew like a knife. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Grace stiffen, preparing to explain once again that things didn't work that way. "Sad because sometimes people need to follow their own paths," he said softly. Chloe studied him for a moment, then nodded as if she understood something the adults couldn't see. "Okay," she said, "but we'll visit, right?" Grace and Matthew looked at each other over the little girl's head. Neither of them answered. That night, after Chloe was asleep, Matthew stayed in his office trying to work, but the words on the computer screen were a blur. The house was quiet, but it was a different silence than he was used to. It was the silence before a farewell. Grace appeared at the office door around 10. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands clasped in her lap. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "for everything. Not just for the job, but for giving us hope when I had none left." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." Grace looked directly at him. "You changed our lives, Matthew. Completely." "You changed mine too," he said before he could stop himself. "How so?" Matthew hesitated. How could he explain that? For the first time in years, he woke up looking forward to the day, that the house had become a home in a way he never imagined possible, that the thought of returning to the silence terrified him. "You made this house feel alive," he said finally. Grace smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "You'll find other people to share your life with, people who actually belong in your world. What if I don't want other people?" The question slipped out before Matthew could think. Grace blinked, surprised. "Matthew, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. He stood up quickly. You're doing the right thing. You and Chloe deserve your independence. Grace was silent for a moment. Thank you for understanding, she said finally, getting up as well. She headed for the door but stopped before leaving. Matthew? Yes? I'm going to miss you a lot too. And then she was gone, leaving Matthew alone with the weight of unspoken words and the certainty that he was about to lose something he didn't know he had been looking for. Grace went back to the room where Chloe was sleeping soundly, her blonde hair spread across the pillow. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched her daughter for a few minutes. She was making the right decision. She was sure of it. Matthew had been too generous, and she couldn't keep taking advantage of his kindness. She had a job now, a chance to start over. It was time to be independent again, so why did it feel like she was making the biggest mistake of her life? Over the last few days, she had caught herself imagining what it would be like if this situation could last forever. If Matthew wasn't just a generous man who had helped them in an emergency, but someone who actually wanted to share his life with them. But that was a fantasy. Men like Matthew Harper didn't fall in love with women like her. He had been kind, compassionate, but that didn't mean anything more than human decency. Grace closed her eyes and tried to focus on the future. A small but clean apartment, a job she enjoyed, Chloe in a good school. It was everything she had ever wanted. So why did it feel like so little now? From the hallway came the sound of footsteps. Matthew was awake too, probably working late as he always did. Grace wondered if he would miss them as much as they would miss him, but she didn't let herself think about it too much. In 3 days, they would be out of his life, and he could go back to his usual routine. It was better this way, it had to be. The mansion was silent for the first time in a week. Matthew woke up on Monday, and for a few confused seconds, expected to hear Chloe's footsteps running down the hall or Grace's voice humming in the kitchen. But there was only silence. The dense, oppressive silence he knew so well, and that now felt suffocating. They had left on Sunday afternoon. Grace had found a small but clean apartment a few miles away. 2 bedrooms, a combined living room and kitchen, a tiny bathroom. It was perfect for the 2 of them, she said, perfect for a new start. Matthew had insisted on paying the security deposit and the first 3 months' rent. Grace resisted at first, but he argued it was just a loan that she could pay him back when she was settled. They both knew it was a lie, but she eventually accepted. At the farewell, Chloe hugged him for so long that Grace had to gently pull her away. I'm going to draw a giant castle for you, the girl whispered in his ear, and I'll deliver it myself. Grace just said thank you one more time, but there was something in her eyes that Matthew couldn't decipher. Sadness. Regret, or just gratitude? Now it was 8 in the morning and the house was dead again. Matthew went down to the kitchen out of habit, but stopped at the entrance. The table was empty. There was no smell of fresh coffee, no carefully arranged plates, no Chloe swinging her legs in a high chair while telling a crazy story. There was only silence and the ghostly memory of how it used to be. He poured a cup of cold coffee from the automatic machine and sat at the enormous table that had once again started to feel absurdly large for one person. He tried to read the news on his phone, but the words didn't make sense. All he could think about was how empty the house felt. Not just empty, dead. For the last 7 days, he had gotten used to waking up with a purpose. There was Grace to talk to during breakfast, Chloe to entertain with her impossible observations about life, a house that pulsed with life and love and mess and joy. Now there was only the echo of his own footsteps on the cold marble. Matthew grabbed his car keys and left for work earlier than usual. Anything was better than being alone in that house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. At the office, Matthew tried to focus on work. There were reports to review, meetings to conduct, important decisions to make, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about Grace, starting her first day at the new job. Was she nervous? Was James treating her well? Did she like the work? He was thinking about Chloe, who would start at a new school the following week. Would she make friends easily? Would she miss the big garden where she could run freely? He was thinking about how small their apartment was compared to the mansion. 2 people in a fraction of the space he occupied alone. It was more logical, more efficient, more suited to their circumstances, so why did it feel completely wrong? Matthew. He looked up. His secretary was at the door, holding a stack of documents. The 10 o'clock meeting was cancelled, she said. Mr. Henderson had an emergency. Right, thanks, Linda. Are you okay? You seem distracted. Matthew hesitated. Linda had worked for him for 5 years and had never shown an interest in his personal life beyond what was professionally necessary. I'm fine, he lied. Are you sure? Because you've been staring out the window for 20 minutes without blinking. Matthew hadn't realized he was staring out the window, nor that Linda had been watching. Just thinking about some things, he said. Linda nodded and left, but Matthew saw the concern in her eyes before the door closed. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Matthew attended meetings without really hearing what was discussed, signed documents without fully reading them, made decisions on an automatic instinct developed over years. When he got home at 7 in the evening, the mansion was exactly as he had left it that morning. Silent, empty, cold. The housekeeper had come during the day. Everything was impeccably clean and organized, as always. But Matthew noticed she had removed the flowers Grace had put in the vases. They had wilted, she explained in a note. She would buy fresh flowers next week. Matthew crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. He didn't want fresh flowers. He wanted Grace gathering flowers from the garden and putting them in makeshift vases, creating beauty from what already existed. He heated a frozen meal in the microwave and ate it standing in the kitchen, refusing to sit alone at that huge table. Then he went up to his room, tried to watch television, tried to read, tried to work. Nothing worked. At 10 o'clock he gave up and went down to the office. Maybe if he worked late, he could tire himself out enough to sleep without thinking. That's when he saw it. The drawing was on the floor, half hidden under the desk. It must have fallen when the housekeeper was cleaning. Matthew bent down and picked up the crumpled paper. It was one of Chloe's drawings, one he hadn't seen before. Carefully, he smoothed out the paper and studied the image. It was a family. 3 stick figures in front of a big house. A woman with yellow hair, a smaller child also with yellow hair, and a tall man with dark hair. But this drawing was different from the others Chloe had made. In this one, the 3 figures were holding hands, all smiling. And in the top corner, written in the uneven handwriting of a 5-year-old Yin was Gi, my happy family. Matthew sat down heavily in his office chair, the drawing trembling in his hands. My happy family. Chloe had drawn him as part of her family, not as a friend, not as someone who had helped them temporarily, as family. And for the first time since they had left, Matthew allowed the truth he had been avoiding to finally surface. He wanted that life. He wanted to be the dark-haired man in Chloe's drawing. He wanted to hold Grace's and Chloe's hands every day. He wanted to wake up to the sound of laughter in the kitchen and go to sleep knowing the people he loved were safe in the room next door. Because he loved them. He loved Grace with her quiet strength and her ability to find beauty anywhere. He loved how she made breakfast as if it were a gift, how she cared for her daughter without ever losing her patience, how she turned any space into a home just by being in it. And he loved Chloe with her impossible wisdom and her ability to ask questions that went straight to the heart of things. He loved how she ran through the hallways filling the house with life, how she hugged without reservation, how she saw the world with eyes full of possibilities. Matthew looked around the silent office, then at the empty house beyond the door, then back at the drawing. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid it was too late to get it. Matthew didn't sleep that night. He stayed up looking at Chloe's drawing, thinking about everything that had happened in the last week, thinking about how Grace had looked at him when he found her the job, thinking about Chloe's question of why he didn't just ask them to stay, thinking about how at their farewell, Grace had lingered for an extra second before pulling away from their hug. Had he imagined it? Or was there something there he hadn't had the courage to acknowledge? At 6 in the morning, Matthew made a decision. He didn't know if Grace felt the same way about him. He didn't know if she would agree to come back, or if it would be fair to ask after she had worked so hard to gain her independence. But he knew he had to try. because a lifetime of regret would be worse than the risk of rejection. Matthew dressed carefully, not the usual suit, but a blue dress shirt that Grace had once complimented and casual dark pants. He wanted to look professional, but not intimidating. He wanted to look like himself, but the best version of himself. He tucked Chloe's drawing into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he took his keys and drove to James's office. The entire drive, he rehearsed what he would say. But when he arrived at the building where Grace worked, all the words he had prepared vanished from his mind. How do you tell someone you've never loved anyone until you met them? How do you ask someone who fought so hard for independence to consider sharing their life with you? How do you explain that a house isn't a home without the right people in it? Matthew parked in front of the building and sat in the car for a few minutes, watching people come and go. Grace was inside, probably focused on her work, building the new life she wanted so badly. He had no right to interrupt that, but he also couldn't live without her. Matthew took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked into the building. The receptionist smiled as he approached. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Grace Coleman. She works here." "Of course. May I ask who is looking for her?" "Matthew Harper." "One moment, please." The receptionist made a call to somewhere in the building, spoke softly, then hung up. "She'll be down in a few minutes. You can wait over there." Matthew sat in one of the lobby armchairs, his heart beating faster than usual. Part of him wanted to run. Part of him wanted to stay there forever, postponing the moment of truth. Then he saw her. Grace came out of the elevator wearing a simple but elegant dress that Matthew didn't recognize. She had probably bought it for the new job. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun, but a few strands had escaped and framed her face. She was beautiful. But more than that, she was radiant. There was a confidence in her that Matthew had never seen before. "Matthew?" Grace approached with a confused expression. "What are you doing here? Did something happen to Chloe?" No, Chloe's fine. She's at school." "Then what?" Matthew stood up, his rehearsed words evaporating completely. "I need to talk to you," he said. Grace looked around the lobby, conscious that they were being watched. "Now, I'm working, Matthew. I know, and I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I need to tell you something." Something in the urgency of his voice made Grace stop protesting. "All right, there's a coffee shop on the corner. We can talk there quickly." The coffee shop was small and cozy, with wooden tables and the aroma of fresh beans in the air. Grace ordered a simple coffee. Matthew ordered the same, but neither of them touched their drinks. "Matthew, you're scaring me," Grace said. "What's going on?" Matthew looked at her sitting across from him. Her eyes were the same light blue as Chloe's, but there was a maturity there, a depth that came from having lived, lost, survived. It was now or never. "I found a drawing of Chloe's last night," he began, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket. Grace looked at the drawing and her face softened. "She's always drawing something. This one is different." Matthew pointed to the words in the corner. "She wrote, 'My happy family,' and she drew me as part of the family." Grace studied the drawing more closely, and Matthew saw something flicker in her eyes. "Matthew, I've never had a family," he continued, the words rushing out in a desperate hurry. "I never knew what it was like to have people who cared about me, who wanted to be with me not because of my money or what I could do for them, but just for who I am." Grace said nothing, but she didn't look away. "And then you two appeared in my life," Matthew went on, "and suddenly I knew. I knew what it's like to wake up looking forward to the day because there are people you love waiting for you. I knew what it's like for a house to feel like a home. I knew what it's like to want to protect someone more than yourself." "Matthew, stop," Grace whispered. "I can't stop." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because I've never loved anyone. Until I met you." The words hung in the air between them. Grace blinked as if she'd been slapped. "You can't say that," she whispered. "I can, and I am." Matthew reached his hand across the table, but didn't touch her. "I love you, Grace. I love you and I love Chloe. And I don't want my house without you. I don't want my life without you." Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Matthew, "You don't understand. I just got this job. I just rented an apartment. Chloe is starting a new school. We're rebuilding our lives." "I know, and I have no right to ask this, but I'm asking anyway." His voice faltered slightly. "Because I've discovered that a life without love isn't a life. It's just an existence." Grace opened her eyes and looked at him for a long moment. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked softly. "What if it does?" The silence stretched between them. Matthew could hear his own heart beating, could feel his entire future depending on her answer. "And I love you too," Grace whispered finally, and Matthew's world changed forever. The first snow of winter began to fall on the morning Grace and Chloe came home. Matthew was at the living room window, watching the small, delicate flakes dance in the air when he heard the sound of a car in the driveway. His heart sped up. After their conversation at the coffee shop 3 days earlier, they had decided to come back. Not as temporary guests this time, but as family. Grace had spoken to James, explaining she needed a few days to get organized. He was understanding, after all. Matthew had called him personally the day before, explaining the situation and asking for flexibility. James had laughed and said that only a man in love would make a call like that. Matthew hadn't denied it. Through the window, he saw Grace getting out of the car he had lent her to get their things from the apartment. She was wearing the blue coat he remembered from the first day, but now there was something different in her posture. Not the defensive determination of someone fighting to survive, but the serene confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Chloe jumped out of the back seat, carrying a small suitcase and the faded teddy bear. Her blonde hair shone even in the grey light of the cloudy morning. Matthew went out to meet them at the door, and when Chloe saw him, she dropped everything and ran toward him. "Matthew," she shouted, her arms wide open. He knelt and hugged her, feeling the little girl cling to his neck as if she would never let go. "I missed you," she mumbled against his ear. "I missed you too," he replied, and it was the purest truth he had ever spoken. "Dad!" The word came from Chloe so naturally that for a moment Matthew thought he had imagined it. He pulled back a little to look at her face, confused. "What did you say?" "Dad," Chloe repeated, as if it were obvious. "Mummy said we're a real family now." "And you're my dad now." Matthew looked over Chloe's head at Grace, who was standing by the car with a shy but hopeful expression. "I explained it to her on the way," Grace said softly. "If you don't mind." "Mind?" Matthew stood up, still holding Chloe. "It would be an honor." The girl smiled, that radiant smile that lit up everything around her. "Now you won't be lonely anymore," she declared with the simple wisdom of a 5-year-old. "Never again," Matthew agreed, looking at Grace. They spent the morning organizing their things. Grace had only brought the essentials from the apartment: clothes, a few books, Chloe's drawings, and some photographs of Michael. Matthew watched as she placed a photo of her late husband on the dresser in the room they would now share. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Michael is a part of your story," Matthew replied, "and I want to know the whole story." Grace smiled and gently touched the photo frame. "He would have liked you," she said. "He would have liked knowing we found someone who loves us as much as he did." Matthew pulled her into a hug, marveling at the extraordinary woman he was lucky enough to love. Grace was not only strong and brave, she was generous enough to include the past in the present, to honor what was while building what would be. After lunch, Chloe discovered the snow was still falling. "Dad said, Mummy, it's snowing," she yelled from the living room window. It was the first time Matthew had heard someone call him Dad, and he still felt a jolt of joy every time it happened. "Can we play in the snow?" Chloe asked, hopping from one foot to the other. "Of course," Grace answered. "But first, let's find some warm clothes." They spent the next 20 minutes looking for suitable coats, gloves, and scarves. Matthew didn't have any children's winter clothes, so they improvised with one of his own scarves, wrapped several times around Chloe's neck, and a pair of his gloves that were huge on her small hands. "I look like a walking snowman," Chloe laughed, looking at herself in the hall mirror. "The most beautiful snowman I've ever seen," Matthew said, and she beamed as if it were the greatest compliment in the world. The garden was transformed. The snow had covered everything with a pristine white blanket, making the trees look like they were carved from crystal, and the lawn a blank canvas waiting to be painted. Chloe immediately ran to the center of the garden and threw herself into the snow, moving her arms and legs to make snow angels. Matthew and Grace stood on the porch for a moment, watching her play. "She's so happy," Grace murmured. "And you?" Matthew asked. "Are you happy?" Grace turned to him, her eyes shining. "Happier than I ever thought I would be again." She moved closer and kissed him softly, a kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings. "Come make a snowman with me," Chloe shouted from the garden. "Let's go," Grace said, taking Matthew's hand. Making a snowman, Matthew discovered, was more complicated than it looked. Chloe had very specific ideas about how it should be. It needed to be tall but not too tall, have perfectly symmetrical arms, and a smile that was cheerful but not creepy. Grace and Matthew took turns rolling the snow while Chloe supervised, giving detailed instructions on every aspect of the construction. "Now the head is crooked," she observed when they placed the smaller ball on top. "It is," Grace agreed, adjusting its position. "Now it needs eyes." "How about these pebbles?" Matthew suggested, picking up 2 small dark stones from the flower bed. "Perfect." They worked together for over an hour, adding sticks for arms, stones for buttons, and a carrot that Grace fetched from the kitchen for the nose. Matthew had never built a snowman in his life. He'd never had the chance as a child, and had never thought about it as an adult. Now he understood what he had been missing. It wasn't about the snowman itself, but about the shared laughter, the hands working together to create something, the pure joy of doing something with no purpose other than fun. "Done," Chloe announced when they finished. "It's the most beautiful snowman in the world." Matthew looked at the slightly crooked and definitely imperfect creation they had made together. "It sure is," he agreed. When the snow started to fall heavier, they went back inside. Grace made hot chocolate while Matthew lit the fireplace in the living room. Chloe snuggled on the sofa between them, still talking excitedly about the snowman and all the plans she had for playing in the garden in the coming days. "Tomorrow we can have a snowball fight," she said. "And maybe a snow house for the snowman." "We can," Matthew agreed, putting his arm around her. "And next weekend we can make another snowman. But this one will be a snow woman to keep the first one company." "How many snowmen do you plan on making?" Grace asked, laughing. "As many as will fit in the garden," Chloe answered with conviction. Matthew pictured the garden full of imperfect snowmen and smiled. 6 months ago, the idea of children messing up his meticulously cared-for garden would have horrified him. Now he couldn't imagine anything better. Later, when Chloe dozed off on the sofa, exhausted from playing in the snow, Matthew and Grace sat in comfortable silence, watching her sleep. "Oh, thank you," Grace whispered. "For what?" "For giving us this, a family, a home, a chance to be happy again." Matthew looked around the room. The walls still displayed Chloe's drawings, now accompanied by some photos Grace had brought. There were toys scattered on the floor, half-finished mugs of hot chocolate on the coffee table, and the aroma of home-cooked food coming from the kitchen where Grace had left something simmering for dinner. The mansion that had been a beautiful but empty place for so long now pulsed with life. Not the controlled, quiet life he had always known, but the messy, loud, and absolutely perfect life of a real family. "Thank you," he said, pulling Grace closer, "for teaching me how to love." Grace snuggled against him, and Matthew felt a peace he never knew existed. Through the window, he could see the snowman they had built together, already partially covered by the fresh snow that continued to fall. Tomorrow, there would be more snow, more games, more laughter. There would be breakfast at the huge table that finally served a family. There would be bedtime stories. There would be 1,000 small moments that would turn the house into a living thing. Matthew Harper, the man who had never loved anyone, finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in the numbers in his bank account or the value of his possessions. It was right there, in that warm room, with the woman he loved in his arms and the child who called him Dad dreaming on the sofa beside them. It was in the family they had built together, unlikely and perfect, born from desperation, but flourishing in love. For the first time in his life, Matthew was truly home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.